Ukraine waited for Russian MiG-29 to land, then tracked it and wiped out the entire airbase. Breaking reports confirm a Ukrainian strike destroyed a Russian MiG-29 moments after it landed at Kacha Air Base in occupied Crimea. Let's understand why Ukraine waited for this exact moment, and why hitting an airbase now changes the entire air war over the Black Sea. The chilly night air over the Crimean Peninsula was thick with the scent of aviation fuel and the lingering ozone of a war that had dragged on far longer than the invaders had ever anticipated. It was 2:41 a.m. on December 4th, 2025. The darkness at Kacha Air Base, situated on the western coast of occupied Crimea, was deceptive. To the uninitiated eye, the facility appeared dormant, a sleeping giant of Russian naval aviation nestled against the Black Sea. But for those watching from the shadows, and there were always eyes watching, the base was alive with the mechanical rhythm of a war machine that was slowly, methodically, being dismantled. Seconds earlier, the distinct high-pitched whine of twin Klymov RD-33 turbofan engines had shattered the silence of the coastal night. A Russian MiG-29, bearing the tail number Red 24, had just touched down on the concrete runway. Its tires screeched against the tarmac, a sound that usually signaled safety and the end of a shift, but tonight signaled something far more final. This specific aircraft had just returned from a sortie lasting more than 3 hours, a grueling mission that had taken it north of the occupation line. Its payload had been delivered not against military fortifications or hardened bunkers, but towards the residential sectors near Novuzern, north of Kherson. This region, already scarred by years of conflict, had once again been the target of indiscriminate air raids, a hallmark of a Russian air campaign that had grown increasingly desperate as its precision stockpiles dwindled and its pilots grew weary. The two pilots inside the cockpit of Red 24 exhaled, the adrenaline of the mission slowly fading into the heavy fatigue of combat flight. They taxied the fighter jet to its designated hardstand on the apron, a spot they believed was a sanctuary protected by the vaunted, yet increasingly porous, air defense umbrella of the Crimean occupation forces. As they powered down the engines, the turbines spun down with a descending whine, but the heat radiating from the exhaust nozzles was palpable, while the air around the rear of the fuselage shimmered, distorting the view of the ground crew rushing to service the aircraft. The metal skin of the MiG ticked and pinged as it began to cool, radiating the intense thermal energy generated during its high-speed return flight. The pilots stepped out of the cockpit with a relaxed mindset, removing their helmets and stretching their stiff limbs. In their minds, the danger was behind them. They were back at Kacha, deep within the perceived fortress of Crimea, miles away from the front lines, where Ukrainian air defenses had made the airspace a lethal gauntlet. They prepared to celebrate what they deemed a successful mission, perhaps looking forward to a warm meal and the sleep of the just. They had no way of knowing that their mission had not gone unnoticed, but they had no way of knowing that the heat signature of their engines, glowing like a beacon in the infrared spectrum, was being watched. Ukraine had not just been defending, it had been hunting. For months, the Ukrainian Main Intelligence Directorate, known as the GUR, had been shifting its strategy from simple attrition to targeted, high-value elimination. The unit responsible for tonight's operation was the Primary Special Unit, a group whose name translated to phantoms or ghosts. They were a phantom force that had bedeviled the Russian Black Sea Fleet and aviation regiments throughout 2025. Their methodology was not based on random shelling, but on patience, surveillance, and the ruthless exploitation of enemy complacency. The pilots of Red 24 believed they were anonymous in the night sky. But they had been tracked from the moment they lifted off hours earlier. The drones came in low over the darkened water, skimming the Black Sea at a height that made them indistinguishable from sea clutter on the few surviving Russian sensors. Each carried a memory of the target already burned into its guidance system. The shape of a MiG's tail, the rectangular geometry of a hardened shelter door, the warm, unmistakable signature of fuel trucks parked too close together. They were patient machines, designed not merely to strike, but to choose the moment of maximum effect. Inside Kacha Air Base, the atmosphere was deceptively routine. Ground crews moved with practiced familiarity, refueling jets, checking tires, scribbling notes on clipboards illuminated by red filtered flashlights. Red 24 sat quietly on its hardstand, and its fuselage still warm from the sortie over Kherson. The pilot had climbed down the ladder with the casual relief of someone who believed they had survived another night. He did not know that his aircraft's transponder data, engine vibration patterns, and even the unique wear on its landing gear had already been cataloged, matched, and confirmed by Ukrainian analysts hundreds of kilometers away. The primary unit's command cell watched the feeds in silence. There was no chatter, no bravado. Only timestamps, telemetry, and a slowly shrinking distance counter. The drones had been launched hours earlier from disparate locations, some from Ukrainian-held coastline, others from mobile platforms that would be gone by morning. Individually, they were survivable losses. Together, they were a coordinated sentence. A Russian electronic warfare unit sensed something was wrong seconds too late. Jamming systems flared to life, flooding the spectrum with noise. But the drones had been built for this environment. They switched frequencies, then modes, then stopped listening altogether. In their final approach, they relied on onboard recognition, comparing the scene below to stored images with merciless precision. Flares fired uselessly into the night sky. Searchlights snapped on, sweeping across concrete and steel, illuminating nothing but startled men and long shadows. The first impact was surgical. A drone dove into a maintenance hangar adjacent to Red 24's position, detonating not with a thunderous blast, but with a focused directional charge that shredded equipment racks and ignited stored fuel. Fire blossomed outward, crawling along the ground like a living thing. Alarms wailed, and shouts echoed across the base as crews scrambled, unsure whether this was an isolated incident or the beginning of something far worse. They found out quickly. A second drone struck the fuel truck parked behind Red 24, turning it into a fireball that rolled across the apron. The heat wave slammed into the MiG-29, warping panels and rupturing internal lines. A third munition followed, plunging directly into the aircraft's midsection. The explosion tore through the jet with brutal finality, scattering fragments of aluminum and composite across the tarmac. Red 24 ceased to exist as an aircraft, reduced instead to a burning outline and a column of smoke that rose straight into the Crimean night. Panic spread faster than the flames. Pilots sprinted for cover, and some diving into drainage ditches, others freezing in place as secondary detonations rippled through the base. Commanders shouted conflicting orders over clogged radios. The assumption that Crimea was a sanctuary, too deep, too defended, too politically sensitive to be struck with impunity, collapsed in a matter of minutes. Ukrainian intelligence confirmed the success of the strike through a cascade of signals that left little room for doubt. Thermal activity flared and vanished. Updated satellite passes revealed scorched concrete, and an empty hardstand where a combat aircraft had recently stood. Unfiltered images and videos briefly surfaced from nearby civilian areas, capturing distant fireballs and the deep concussion of explosions before censorship closed in. Together, these fragments formed a clear picture. The target had been found, tracked, and erased. Another entry was added to a growing record that was steadily reshaping the story of the war. The psychological shock was immediate. At Kacha Air Base, Russian pilots did not need explicit grounding orders. Confidence collapsed on its own. The realization was chilling. An aircraft could complete a mission, return home, and still be destroyed hours later. Speed, maneuverability, and experience suddenly felt irrelevant. Morning briefings were tense and uncertain. Officers questioned the integrity of the base, the reliability of radars, and whether unseen drones were already inbound. No one could offer reassuring answers. For Ukraine, the operation was never about a single aircraft. It was a carefully constructed message. And the strike demonstrated that modern warfare had shifted beyond visible front lines into a realm dominated by patience, intelligence, and psychological pressure. By choosing to attack at a moment of vulnerability rather than during combat, Ukrainian commanders showed they could shape events long after the noise of battle had faded. The impact lingered far beyond the physical destruction. In the early hours before dawn, smoke still drifted above the airfield. Fire crews moved through wreckage in exhausted silence, illuminated by emergency lights and glowing embers. Elsewhere, the Ukrainian unit responsible had already vanished, scrubbing digital traces and preparing for future missions. The aircraft was gone, but the sense of exposure it created remained. A fortified base on occupied territory had been revealed as anything but safe, and the drone responsible for the strike homed in on heat. The residual warmth of engines fresh from a sortie stood out sharply against the cold concrete. That lingering heat became a beacon. Guided by artificial intelligence, the drone adjusted its course and plunged from the night sky with lethal accuracy. The moment of impact was catastrophic. Fuel ignited, hydraulic systems exploded, and a massive fireball turned darkness into blinding light. Nearby structures shuddered under the shockwave, windows shattered, and personnel were thrown to the ground. Within seconds, a sophisticated combat aircraft was reduced to a twisted skeleton of burning metal. Secondary explosions followed as onboard munitions detonated, amplifying the devastation. The precision of the strike extended beyond the aircraft itself, wrecking support vehicles and rendering an entire section of the airfield unusable. What had been a symbol of air power became debris scattered across scorched concrete. Strategically, the loss was far more damaging than the destruction of a single jet. The base had been considered a rear area sanctuary, home to fighters, transports, and specialized maritime aircraft, essential to operations in the Black Sea. Earlier strikes had already removed key capabilities, blinding naval forces and degrading search and rescue capacity. The destruction of a frontline fighter signaled that no asset, however valuable or well protected, was beyond reach. This failure exposed the erosion of Russian air defenses in Crimea. Long-range radar systems had been systematically targeted, forcing mobile defenses closer to high-value assets and making them vulnerable in turn. The resulting cycle of degradation left aircraft exposed in the one place they were supposed to be safest: on the ground. The strike illustrated how layered defenses could be dismantled piece by piece through coordinated intelligence and precision attacks. The contrast in mindset between the two sides was stark. Russian pilots returned from missions assuming danger had passed. Fatigue, routine, and misplaced confidence bred complacency. Ukrainian operators, by contrast, treated every phase of an enemy sortie as an opportunity. They exploited predictable behavior, turning both physical vulnerabilities, like residual engine heat, and psychological ones, into targeting advantages. The war did not pause when an aircraft landed, but the choice of target carried symbolic weight. The aircraft had been involved in attacks on civilian areas, and its destruction conveyed a blunt message. There would be no impunity. Pilots who struck cities could not expect safety after returning to base. This pressure steadily eroded morale, increasing fatigue, mistakes, and resistance within the ranks. The sense of being constantly watched became as damaging as any physical loss. International observers quietly took note. Analysts pointed out that while Russia still possessed large numbers of aircraft, its ability to generate effective sorties was declining. Threatened bases forced dispersal to more distant airfields, increasing flight times, maintenance strain, and reducing time over targets. Each forced relocation translated into greater safety for Ukrainian cities. The strike also highlighted Ukraine's rapid technological evolution. Domestically produced drones, integrated with advanced guidance systems, had neutralized electronic warfare advantages and demonstrated innovation at speed. This operation was part of a broader campaign that targeted logistics, fuel supplies, and command infrastructure, steadily starving remaining aircraft of the means to operate. By early 2026, the strategic balance had shifted. Crimea, once a secure hub of power projection, had become a liability. Airfields turned into targets, fleets withdrew, and air regiments contemplated retreat. Control of the skies was no longer measured by aircraft counts, but by the ability to deny airspace to the enemy. The destruction of that single jet encapsulated the new reality. In a war of information, precision, and persistence, but dominance belonged to those who could see first, wait longest, and strike last. If this analysis helped you see what's really happening behind the headlines, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next breakdown.